Chapter 6 really is the turn from the introductory material on microeconomics to talking about the true subject of this course, which is macroeconomics. Again, macro being the sort of large-scale factors that we think about when we think about economies like GDP, unemployment, inflation, and so forth, economic growth. So Chapter 6, of course, is about GDP, gross domestic product. Let me say a couple of things off the top to understand. Gross domestic product is the way that we try to measure economic growth. It, as you'll see in the course of the chapter and this lecture, it's a very imperfect measure of economic growth for a bunch of different reasons. But nonetheless, it's the best thing we have. And in particular, what we focus on is a GDP, gross domestic product, per capita. That is, we want to know what is the average amount of GDP per person in an economy. Obviously, bigger economy like the United States, just because it has more people, is going to have more economic activity and therefore higher GDP. Smaller countries will have smaller GDPs because they have fewer people. So what really matters is what's the GDP per person, per capita. That's one of the things that we really care about. We also, and we'll talk some about this later in this lecture, have to distinguish between what we call nominal and real GDP. One of the problems with GDP is that we use prices to calculate it, but if prices change over the course of time, right, are we really picking up a change in the sort of real growth and real activity, or are we just picking up a change in prices? We'll come back to that in a little bit. And then we'll talk about some of the problems with using GDP as a guide to output and to welfare and growth and all these kinds of things. But first, okay, let's talk about what GDP is and why we think it's so important. Definition of GDP, which can be found on slide 6 of the PowerPoint, is the market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country in a year. So the market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country in a year. And to get GDP per capita, we just divide that number by the population. What I want to emphasize, though, are the pieces of that GDP definition. First of all, market value. We calculate GDP by adding up all the stuff that we produce, again, subject to things we'll talk about in a minute, right? And we do that according to their market prices. So we use market prices as a measure of value. So it's the market value of all finished goods and services, blah, blah, blah. Also notice the word finished, okay? The goods that matter for GDP are the ones that are bought by the ultimate consumer, that are not intermediate goods, that are not resold, right, over the course of a year. So, for example, if we were to count intermediate goods, right? If we would count intermediate goods and finished goods, we'd be double counting, right? So for example, finished goods again are the ones sold to final users and then either consumed or held in inventories. Intermediate goods are sold to firms and then bundled or processed or used with other things for sale at a later stage. If we think about, for example, selling a bookcase that you take home and use to store books, if we counted, GDP counts that final value of that bookcase. But if we counted the value of the wood that got sold by the lumber company to the bookshelf manufacturer, we'd be double counting because we'd be counting both that intermediate good that went into making the bookcase, the bookshelf, and then the bookshelf itself. All right. We don't want to count the wheat to use wheat bread and the finished wheat bread, as we double count the wheat. So we only count the finished goods. The one thing that we do, however, include in GDP are machinery and equipment, capital, right, that are used to produce other goods are included in GDP. So those are things that never actually get sold, right, to consumers. So you can think about a giant machine that helps make, say, tennis shoes or something like that, right? That's part of GDP because it's never it's in essence a finished good, but the final consumer is not you and me in a household, but rather businesses. Okay. So we talk about market value. We talk about finished goods. All right. We also talk about goods and services. The output of economies, and particularly the U.S. economy these days, includes goods and services. Services include things like medical care and so forth. Services have now become almost 70% of the U.S. economy. So we count that. The money you pay your doctor for a doctor's visit, that counts towards GDP. So does the money you pay to buy the latte at Starbucks that you then drink. Okay. It's also important to recognize that GDP measures production. So sales of old houses, used goods, and financial assets do not add to GDP, are not part of GDP. For used goods, the service of providing them does count. So the profit that the used car dealer makes counts, but not the full value of the car she sold. So if a used car dealer buys a car for $500 and sells it for $2,000, okay, the $1,500 counts towards GDP because that's her service of making the car available, but not the full $2,000 because we've already counted that in the production of the car in the first place. GDP also includes goods and services produced by labor and capital located in the United States, regardless of the nationality of the workers or the property owners. So this is a geographical definition, GDP, right? Gross domestic product. That means it's the things produced in the United States. We used to talk about gross national product, which measures what is produced by the labor and property of U.S. permanent residents. So that was not about geography, that was about people. So for example, with GNP, if a U.S. citizen was located in Germany and was producing something, that counted towards GNP, but it does not count towards GDP. So that's an important difference. The numbers are pretty similar, especially for big economies. But again, there are some differences that we don't worry about too much. Almost everybody today uses GDP. So again, GDP preferred over GNP. One of the things, as I said earlier, that we have to calculate or be concerned about is the difference between real and nominal GDP. So when we calculate nominal, what we call nominal GDP, is using the prices at the time of sale. So GDP in 2016 is calculated using 2016 prices. GDP in 2010, we calculate with 2010 prices. The problem is this creates a problem in comparing GDP prices, GDP over time. What we can't determine is whether an increase in that nominal GDP measure was due to more stuff, greater production, or just an increase in prices. If you want to think about an analogy here, right? Suppose you're trying to measure two pieces of wood and you have a ruler and you measure the first piece. The piece of wood turns out to be 18 inches long, and you measure the second piece and it turns out to be 20 inches long, and you conclude that the second piece was bigger. But the assumption you're making there, right, is that your ruler is constant between the two. But if the sort of space between the inches on your ruler has changed, they might both be 18 inches, but the second one will show up as 20 because the ruler has shrunk, as it were, has condensed the space. And that's essentially what happens when prices go up and down, right? Is the ruler, the thing we try to use constant to compare GDP, changes, and then we can't rely on it. So what we need to do is find a way to take out the effect of prices and to just look at what's the effect of real production. And so what we try to do is calculate GDP in what we call constant prices. So to take the example from the PowerPoint, if you have the PowerPoint up, it's on slide 20, right? We calculate nominal GDP in 2016 by taking the prices of 2016 and we multiply that by the 2016 quantity. Same with nominal GDP in 2000 prices times 2000 quantities. But if we want to calculate real GDP in the year, say, 2000, what we want to do is say, all right, let's take the year 2000 quantities, but the year 2016 prices. That enables us to eliminate the change in prices. Now we have 2016 prices for the 2016 GDP, 2016 prices for the 2000 GDP, right? And if the prices were the same in both, if prices had been the same in both years, right, we can calculate that 2000 real GDP as again on that slide as 14 trillion. But what this lets us do is take out the influence of changing prices and just compare changes in real production. And that's really important, right? And in general, in macroeconomics, when we use the phrase real variables, and that's normally what we want to talk about, real variables such as real GDP are ones that have been adjusted for changes in prices by using the same set of prices across all time periods. So whenever we compare across time in economics, these sort of big macro indicators, we want to adjust for inflation. We want to take out the effects of inflation or presumably deflation, and we want to use constant prices. That's how we get these. That's how we get real variables. Okay, so that's really important. There's a number of exercises in the book and in the PowerPoint that let you do that. They also walk through a number of different ways that you can calculate real differences as opposed to nominal ones, including the GDP deflator, which does things a little bit differently. Okay. We also should note the difference between GDP growth, real GDP growth rates, year-over-year growth rates, and the level of GDP, even per capita, right? We can measure GDP year to year and look at the level, but sometimes what we're interested in is how much did it grow from year to year. So that's one of the things that we want to pay attention to. One of the other things I want to talk about, however, is the way in which some of the problems with GDP. The most important thing to recognize with GDP is that GDP does not calculate sort of welfare or well-being. It calculates production, activity, stuff, right? One way to think about GDP, it's like body weight. It does not tell us whether a person who weighs 300 pounds is muscular, is fit, or is fat. It doesn't tell us. All it tells us is the person weighs 300 pounds, right? And so GDP just measures that stuff. It does not tell us about whether the stuff is valuable or wasteful or enhancing welfare or whatever it may be. So there's a couple of things that we want to think about with respect to GDP in this way. Some of the things that GDP doesn't account for include illegal or underground market transactions. So, buying and selling drugs in states where drugs are illegal, prostitution, all this kind of stuff that is illegal or underground market transactions don't get included in GDP. And, in the United States, this might not be a huge problem, but in other countries where there's high level of corruption and high level of tax avoidance and things like that, underground transactions like that can be extremely significant. And so GDP is probably undercounting the real activity in the economy. As the textbook points out, in Latin America, the informal sector is estimated at 41% of officially measured GDP. United States, Western Europe, more like 10 to 20%. So that's a pretty big difference, but 41% is big, and that means that GDP is being undercounted in those parts of the world. GDP does not count non-priced production when valuable stuff is produced but no monetary payment is made. The best example of this is housework, right? A stay-at-home mom or dad who's producing something valuable, absolutely valuable services, but no monetary payment is made. That doesn't count at all towards GDP. Okay, any volunteer work that you do does not count towards GDP. Doesn't mean it's not valuable. In fact, it's very valuable, but it doesn't count towards GDP. And you can imagine, right, that what this does is it introduces a couple of biases into GDP statistics, right? Certainly, as in the United States case, more women have entered into the workforce. Housework has shifted from unpaid to paid, so that might be we're paying people to clean our houses rather than mostly women doing it. Right, so the same amount of work is getting done, but GDP is going to look bigger because we're paying for it. Okay, and women's participation in the workforce varies across countries, and that underestimates the proportion of work included in GDP. So again, we'd somehow like to take account of that if we could. And many feminist economists have sort of raised this criticism. It's not clear what the best adjustment is, but certainly it's a valid criticism to say that historically women's work did not count in this way. The other thing about GDP is that, again, it adds up the value of finished goods and services, but doesn't subtract the value of what we call bads, right? Doesn't subtract pollution. It doesn't subtract, changing supplies of natural resources. It doesn't subtract criminal activity. And in fact, one of the interesting things about GDP is that it counts toward one of the things that counts towards GDP is expenditures we make to prevent bads from happening. If you put multiple locks on your door, because you expect there to be a large level of crime, right? All of that activity adds to GDP. If I throw a rock through your window and break it, okay, the services to fix your window add to GDP. But it's sort of in one sense, right? One way this doesn't seem to make sense. Why should those activities add to GDP? Certainly fixing the window gets us back to where we were before. It doesn't add any new value. And we can think about the crime example, the locks on the door, something like this way. In a world where there was much less crime, we wouldn't have to undertake those expenditures. So one of the things that crime does is it induces us to make those expenditures, which are wasteful, even though they count towards GDP in a world compared to a world where there is less crime. So that's a serious concern with GDP, is that these expenditures that are really about preventing bad things from happening are counted towards GDP, but in some sense, they're not producing actual wealth or well-being or anything else. They're just preventing something bad from happening or fixing a problem. So again, this is another way to think of another issue that we think about with GDP all the time. So those are some thoughts about GDP. As I said, it's not perfect. It's not ideal, but it is the best game we have in town, and we do have reliable numbers on GDP that we compare year to year. The flaws remain roughly the same, at least over the short and medium run. So we can still engage in comparisons about GDP per capita over time, compare GDP per capita across countries, and as we think about economic growth and as we talk about it in the next few chapters, GDP per capita is going to be a key indicator, and later on as we begin to talk about policy and things like that, there too, GDP and GDP per capita are going to be key. So whatever its flaws, it's still the best option we have.